Everyone, Mr. Chaffin here. I'm going to do a really quick review video for the Colonial Era, or at least as quick as I know how. I'm going to try to keep it around 10 minutes, but I do love to talk, so we'll see how that goes. I am going to start at the very beginning, what we learned literally like the first day of class, and that was how do we categorize information in U.S. history? And so we learned an acronym called PEGS, P-E-G-S, in order to help us out. And so we're just going to start with the letter P. As a foundation of what we can build on top of. All right, so P stands for political, which we said was all things government, including acquiring new land and voting. So those are the two top things that we learned about politically this unit. E stood for economic, which is all things money or currency or trade or profit was a big word that we learned about this era, including labor. Labor is an economic transaction that you exchange your work for some sort of monetary or money return, okay, like a paycheck. G stands for geography. Geo, G-E-O, the prefix of the word literally means earth, okay? And so when we talk about geography, we're talking about all things natural. And so landforms, physical maps, weather and soil, those are also lumped into a place's geography. S stands for social. And we learned that social is all about human interaction. And so the thing that we particularly learned about in this unit or this era was religion, how religion was a major social aspect of sort of why the colonies were founded. We also learned about debtors, in Georgia, like the idea that, debtors are a group of people and they're interacting with society based on the fact that, they're sort of lumped together as this group. Okay, so from there, we took that information and we started applying it to the reasons for European exploration. And when we really just talked about three countries, Spain, France, and England, and the primary reasons why they started exploring the New World. And kind of what you need to know from that is Spain came over here for the spreading of the Catholic religion. France came over here for the fur trade. Remember, F to F, France to fur. And then England came over here for religious freedom. Okay, so beyond that, we started kind of hyper-focusing in on English settlements, in particular Jamestown and Plymouth. We needed to know the primary reasons why both of those were settled. We drew a $sign for Jamestown. We drew a cross for Plymouth. So Jamestown was founded for commercial profit. Plymouth was founded for religious freedom. Okay, beyond that, we then started talking about the economic geography of the three regions. And so we know there's 13 colonies, but there's three regions. So New England, Middle, and Southern. And we learned the geography of a place equals the economy of a place. So we talked about, the geographic differences in the regions and how that equaled economic differences in the regions, okay? And so New England had cold weather, rocky soil, lots of trees, lots of fish and whales. And so what that meant for their economy is that they didn't grow a lot of crops. So rocky soil and cold weather, just knowing science, knowing biology, that plants don't like rocky soil and cold weather. And so they're not growing a lot of crops to sell, but they are growing crops to consume or eat. And we call that subsistence farming, when you grow just enough to eat. But some things that they were doing to make money were chopping down all of those trees in those forests and making lumber. They were building ships. They were trading on boats. They were fishing. They were whaling. So, quite a few economic opportunities up in New England. As you go further south to the middle colonies, the soil starts to get more rich. The climate or the weather starts to kind of become more moderate, was our word, mild or moderate. And so they were able to do a few more things with agriculture. In particular, they grew a lot of wheat, a lot of grains, and so it earned them the nickname of the breadbasket. And so beyond that, they raised livestock. So, we always drew our little piggy or our cow to represent livestock. So they weren't consuming these things, they were selling them. And so we're talking about larger scale farming and ranching and agriculture. Okay, so that's the middle colonies. Now we move all the way to the southern colonies, and it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. They have rich, fertile soil, and they have hot, humid weather. Okay, so if you put rich soil, fertile soil, hot weather together, what comes out the other side are cash crops, plantations. So large farms, gigantic farms where they had one purpose, and that was to grow cash crops. which introduced kind of another aspect of their economy, which was slave labor. So on these large farms, you needed people to work them because this is a day before tractors. It's a day before machines and motors and all these things that we have today. Instead of machines doing the work, it's people. And so you needed lots of people to plant the crops, harvest the crops, and eventually, make use of all of the cash crops, including tobacco and rice and indigo. And then eventually cotton would become like the biggest cash crop in American history. But, the point is slave labor was introduced because of the need for more labor on these plantations, which sort of brought us to our next topic, which was the transatlantic slave trade, and why that started to begin with. So we kind of said the transatlantic slave trade started because of the need for slave labor on the plantations. And so the 13 colonies needed slave labor to grow cash crops and other raw materials, which they would send to Europe or Britain. And they would turn those raw materials, those cash crops, into manufactured goods. And they would send them from Europe down to Africa, and they would trade for slaves. And then Africa would send slaves to the colonies or to the Americas overall. And so that formed what we sort of called the transatlantic slave trade or triangular trade. Remember, we drew the triangle for our brain drain. And that's sort of the why behind the reason for slavery in the colonies. It was completely economic. It was completely based on the fact that plantations and cash crops had become super profitable, and people were wanting to make money off of that in the South. But in order to do that, you needed the labor on the plantation. All right, so from there, we kind of took a different path as far as the topics go. We talked about religious freedom in the colonies. So we started referring to all of the sort of the strict religion in Massachusetts where the Puritans settled. Remember, Plymouth is in Massachusetts, and the Pilgrims came over for religious freedom. But the Puritans had maybe a little bit different idea about what religious freedom was, and they actually kind of like kicked you out of Massachusetts if you disagreed with their religious beliefs. And so the government and the religion sort of became one thing in Massachusetts instead of them being separate things later on. And so people like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, they started the colony of Rhode Island for the reason of true religious freedom. A guy named Thomas Hooker started the colony of Connecticut for separation of church and state and religious freedom. A couple other colonies were started for similar reasons. Pennsylvania was started by William Penn. The Quakers were his religious group, and they were sort of the first to be welcomed into Pennsylvania, and then later a lot of different religious groups as well. And then Maryland finally was one of the colonies that was started for religious freedom for Catholics. And so we sing a little song, "Mary Had a Little Catholic." So not Mary Had a Little Lamb, but Mary Had a Little Catholic. Just as an easy way to remember, Maryland and Catholics go together. And then finally, all the way down south in Georgia, we learned that it wasn't a religious reason, but it was sort of still a social reason why Georgia was started. And that was as a place for debtors and prisoners, criminals, basically. So back in the day, if you owed money, if you were a debtor, then that meant that you were technically considered a criminal, and they would send these people to Georgia to pay off their debt, to work off their debt, more like it. And so after that had happened, then they earned their freedom, and sort of the rest is history for those people. But Georgia was started as a place for debtors. All right, so beyond that, religious freedom sort of ended with the First Great Awakening, being this movement, this Christian spiritual movement in the colonies in the 1730s, 1740s. And church typically had become kind of boring, kind of humdrum, like no one was really truly experiencing their faith until these preachers started coming along and being emotional and fiery and kind of speaking to the people, not that God hated them, but that God loved them. And so people were receiving this message, and it just had this huge spiritual revival in America, or in the colonies rather. And it caused something, though. It caused a shift in the way people thought. All of a sudden, they were questioning their religious leaders who had kind of been lying to them all of this time about the way God felt about them and what the Bible said and all these other things. And so religious people, Christians, started getting really brave about questioning their religious leaders, but then also, here's the kicker, questioning their government leaders, even all the way up to the king. And so that's sort of the major impact of religious freedom in the colonies. It not only started new colonies and gave people religious freedom, but it also kind of made people start asking questions, all right? So that's sort of the big takeaway. And then last but not least, we talked about government, and we talked about how the growth of representative government in the colonies was sort of for one primary reason, and that was the distance between the colonies and Great Britain. And the Atlantic Ocean stands between them. That's nearly 2 to 3 months travel time. And so you're talking about too far of a distance for them to travel back and forth to get an answer from the king. So they started creating their own governments. And so we also talked about, what were those governments? And the first one we talked about was the Virginia House of Burgesses, the first representative government where people elected representatives to make laws for them. Okay, then we talked about the Mayflower Compact, where the people chose the laws and leaders for themselves. And that was sort of like a social contract they signed into, kind of like a professional athlete will sign a contract with whatever team they play for. And they're expected to abide by that contract, like follow what's in it. And so it's the same thing with the Mayflower Compact. When they signed their name to it, it was like signing a contract. They're agreeing to the things that they created. And then finally, we talked about the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut and, sort of how it was the first written constitution in the colonies and how big of a deal that was, because if you want your government to be passed on to generations after you, you need to write down the ideas, okay? It can't just begin and end with a person. That's sort of what a king was for. So every time a king changed, the government changed, the laws changed, everything changed because the king was the law. But now that we started writing down our governments, people can have the same laws from generation to generation. I mean, in America have had the Constitution since 1787. I mean, it's been amended a few times, but it's basically the same government that we had before. So the main theme, though, in all of our government talk is that government was trending toward doing away with the king, doing away with the power of the king, and giving that power to the people. Okay, so whether it's through representative government or self-government, the point is the power is no longer with the king, it's with the people. Okay, so remember our brain drains for that. Remember, we drew our house for the House of Burgesses. We drew our flower for the Mayflower Compact, and we had our FC or FOC for the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So make sure you practice those as well. All right, so that's pretty much it. It all starts with European exploration, then goes to Jamestown and Plymouth, then goes to the economic geography. So geo equals econ, geography equals economy of a region. So know your regions, know their geography, know their economy, and know about the Transatlantic Slave Trade, then religious freedom and the growth of government, and you'll be in pretty good shape on this test, okay? And here's where I'll offer sort of some advice on why this is important. If you want to be able to have real discussion in class and get into kind of the fun aspect of history as far as I see it, you have to know the basic facts first. And in order to know the facts, you kind of have to have this repetition thing going. You can't expect to know perfectly everything we talk about in class if you only rely on class to learn the material. You're going to have to go home and do quizzes and study, videos like this and just sort of hear the information over and over again. And then you're going to get comfortable with the facts, and then you can actually start talking about them. Because we want this to become, I think, kind of easy for you. That's our secret. We want it to be easy because if these facts are easy, they're just going to start coming out of you in discussion. And that's sort of that's what makes history fun, is not just memorizing stuff. That's probably why a lot of you have thought history has been boring in the past. It's because you've only been memorizing things. You haven't actually been talking about it. So if you want to have fun talking about these things, then you need to know what you're talking about, okay? It's fun to have opinions, but if your opinions are rooted in things that are not factually true, it's no fun to have that discussion. But if you know your stuff, man, I'm telling you, I'm a teacher that loves to talk about these things. So study, make sure that you're prepared for our test, and put in work beforehand and see the payoff in the end. I believe in you guys. I know you're going to do great. If you have any questions, email me or send me a message in Google Classroom. I'll be happy to help you out. I guess we'll talk to you soon. Bye, guys.